Chapter 15. The Marquis, meanwhile, whose indefatigable search after Julia failed of success, was successively the slave of alternate passions, and he poured forth the spleen of disappointment on his unhappy domestics. The Marchioness, who may now more properly be called Maria del Vellorno, inflamed by artful insinuations the passions already irritated, and heightened with cruel triumph his resentment towards Julia and Madame de Menin. She represented what his feelings too acutely acknowledged, that by the obstinate disobedience of the first and the machinations of the last, a priest had been enabled to arrest his authority as a father, to insult the sacred honor of his nobility, and to overturn at once his proudest schemes of power and ambition. She declared it her opinion that the Abate was acquainted with the place of Julia's present retreat, and upbraided the Marquis with want of spirit in thus submitting to being outwitted by a priest, and forbearing an appeal to the Pope, whose authority would compel the Abate to restore Julia. This reproach stung the very soul of the Marquis. He felt all its force, and was at the same time conscious of his inability to obviate it. The effect of his crimes now fell in severe punishment upon his own head. The threatened secret, which was no other than the imprisonment of the Marchioness, arrested his arm of vengeance, and compelled him to submit to insult and disappointment. But the reproach of Maria sunk deep in his mind. It fomented his pride into redoubled fury, and he now repelled with disdain the idea of submission. He revolved the means which might effect his purpose. He saw but one. This was the death of the Marchioness. The commission of one crime often requires the perpetration of another. When once we enter on the labyrinth of vice, we can seldom return, but are led on through correspondent mazes to destruction. To obviate the effect of his first crime, it was now necessary the Marquis should commit a second, and conceal the imprisonment of the Marchioness by her murder. Himself the only living witness of her existence, when she was removed, the allegations of the Padre Abate would by this means be unsupported by any proof, and he might then boldly appeal to the Pope for the restoration of his child. He mused upon this scheme, and the more he accustomed his mind to contemplate it, the less scrupulous he became. The crime from which he would formerly have shrunk, he now surveyed with a steady eye. The fury of his passions, unaccustomed to resistance, uniting with the force of what ambition termed necessity, urged him to the deed, and he determined upon the murder of his wife. The means of effecting his purpose were easy and various, but as he was not yet so entirely hardened as to be able to view her dying pangs, and imbrue his own hands in her blood, he chose to dispatch her by means of poison, which he resolved to mingle in her food. But a new affliction was preparing for the Marquis, which attacked him where he was most vulnerable, and the veil, which had so long overshadowed his reason, was now to be removed. He was informed by Baptista of the infidelity of Maria del Vellorno. In the first emotion of passion, he spurned the informer from his presence, and disdained to believe the circumstance. A little reflection changed the object of his resentment. He recalled the servant, whose faithfulness he had no reason to distrust, and condescended to interrogate him on the subject of his misfortune. He learned that an intimacy had for some time subsisted between Maria and the Cavalier di Vincini, and that the assignation was usually held at the pavilion on the seashore in an evening. Baptista further declared that if the Marquis desired a confirmation of his words, he might obtain it by visiting this spot at the hour mentioned. This information lighted up the wildest passions of his nature. His former sufferings faded away before the stronger influence of the present misfortune, and it seemed as if he had never tasted misery till now. to suspect the wife upon whom he doted with romantic fondness, on whom he had centered all his firmest hopes of happiness, and for whose sake he had committed the crime which embittered even his present moments, and which would involve him in still deeper guilt, to find her ungrateful to his love, and a traitoress to his honor, produced a misery more poignant than any his imagination had conceived. He was torn by contending passions and opposite resolutions. Now he resolved to expiate her guilt with her blood, and now he melted in all the softness of love. Vengeance and honor bade him strike to the heart which had betrayed him, and urged him instantly to the deed, when the idea of her beauty, her winning smiles, her fond endearments, stole upon his fancy, and subdued his heart. He almost wept at the idea of injuring her, and, in spite of appearances, pronounced her faithful. The succeeding moment plunged him again into uncertainty. His tortures acquired new vigor from cessation, and again he experienced all the frenzy of despair. He was now resolved to end his doubts by repairing to the pavilion, but again his heart wavered in irresolution. How to proceed should his fears be confirmed? In the meantime, he determined to watch the behavior of Maria with severe vigilance. They met at dinner, and he observed her closely, but discovered not the smallest impropriety in her conduct. Her smiles and her beauty again wound their fascinations round his heart, and in the excess of their influence he was almost tempted to repair the injury which his late suspicions had done her by confessing them at her feet. The appearance of the Cavalier de Vincini, however, renewed his suspicions. His heart throbbed wildly, and with restless impatience he watched the return of evening, which would remove his suspense. Night at length came. He repaired to the pavilion, and secreted himself among the trees that embowered it. Many minutes had not passed when he heard a sound of low whispering voices steal from among the trees, and footsteps approaching down the alley. He stood almost petrified with terrible sensations, and presently heard some persons enter the pavilion. The Marquis now emerged from his hiding-place. A faint light issued from the building. He stole to the window, and beheld within Maria and the Cavalier de Vincini. Fired at the sight, he drew his sword and sprang forward. The sound of his step alarmed the Cavalier, who, on perceiving the Marquis, rushed by him from the pavilion and disappeared among the woods. The Marquis pursued, but could not overtake him, and he returned to the pavilion with an intention of plunging his sword in the heart of Maria, when he discovered her senseless on the ground. Pity now suspended his vengeance. He paused in agonizing gaze upon her, and returned his sword into the scabbard. She revived, but on observing the Marquis, screamed and relapsed. He hastened to the castle for assistance, inventing, to conceal his disgrace, some pretence for her sudden illness, and she was conveyed to her chamber. The Marquis was now not suffered to doubt her infidelity, but the passion which her conduct abused, her faithlessness could not subdue. He still doted with absurd fondness, and even regretted that uncertainty could no longer flatter him with hope. It seemed as if his desire of her affection increased with his knowledge of the loss of it, and the very circumstance which should have roused his aversion, by a strange perversity of disposition, appeared to heighten his passion, and to make him think it impossible he could exist without her. When the first energy of his indignation was subsided, he determined, therefore, to reprove and to punish, but hereafter to restore her to favour. In this resolution he went to her apartment, and reprehended her falsehood in terms of just indignation. Maria del Vellorno, in whom the late discovery had roused resentment instead of awakening penitence, and exasperated pride without exciting shame, heard the upbraidings of the Marquis with impatience, and replied to them with acrimonious violence. She boldly asserted her innocence, and instantly invented a story, the plausibility of which might have deceived a man who had evidence less certain than his senses to contradict it. She behaved with the haughtiness the most insolent, and when she perceived that the Marquis was no longer to be misled, and that her violence failed to accomplish its purpose, she had recourse to tears and supplications. But the artifice was too glaring to succeed, and the Marquis quitted her apartment in an agony of resentment. His former fascinations, however, quickly returned, and again held him in suspension between love and vengeance. That the vehemence of his passion, however, might not want an object, he ordered Baptista to discover the retreat of the Cavalier di Vincini, on whom he meant to revenge his lost honour. Shame forbade him to employ others in the search. This discovery suspended for a while the operations of the fatal scheme which had before employed the thoughts of the Marquis, but it had only suspended, not destroyed them. The late occurrence had annihilated his domestic happiness, but his pride now rose to rescue him from despair, and he centered all his future hopes upon ambition. In a moment of cool reflection, he considered that he had derived neither happiness nor content from the pursuit of dissipated pleasures, to which he had hitherto sacrificed every opposing consideration. He resolved, therefore, to abandon the gay schemes of dissipation which had formerly allured him, and dedicate himself entirely to ambition, in the pursuits and delights of which he hoped to bury all his cares. He therefore became more earnest than ever for the marriage of Julia with the Duke de Luovo, through whose means he designed to involve himself in the interests of the state, and determined to recover her at whatever consequence. He resolved without further delay to appeal to the Pope, but to do this with safety it was necessary that the Marchioness should die, and he returned therefore to the consideration and execution of his diabolical purpose. He mingled a poisonous drug with the food he designed for her, and when night arrived, carried it to the cell. As he unlocked the door, his hand trembled, and when he presented the food, and looked consciously for the last time upon the Marchioness, who received it with humble thankfulness, his heart almost relented. His countenance, over which was diffused the paleness of death, expressed the secret movements of his soul, and he gazed upon her with eyes of stiffened horror. Alarmed by his looks, she fell upon her knees to supplicate his pity. Her attitude recalled his bewildered senses, and endeavouring to assume a tranquil aspect, he bade her rise, and instantly quitted the cell, fearful of the instability of his purpose. His mind was not yet sufficiently hardened by guilt to repel the arrows of conscience, and his imagination responded to her power. As he passed through the long dreary passages from the prison, solemn and mysterious sounds seemed to speak in every murmur of the blast which crept along their windings, and he often started and looked back. He reached his chamber, and having shut the door, surveyed the room in fearful examination. Ideal forms flitted before his fancy, and for the first time in his life he feared to be alone. Shame only withheld him from calling Baptista. The gloom of the hour and the death-like silence that prevailed assisted the horrors of his imagination. He half repented of the deed, yet deemed it now too late to obviate it, and threw himself on his bed in terrible emotion. His head grew dizzy, and a sudden faintness overcame him. He hesitated, and at length arose to ring for assistance, but found himself unable to stand. In a few moments he was somewhat revived, and rang his bell, but before any person appeared, he was seized with terrible pains, and staggering to his bed, sunk senseless upon it. Here Baptista, who was the first person that entered his room, found him struggling, seemingly in the agonies of death. The whole castle was immediately roused, and the confusion may be more easily imagined than described. Amelia, amid the general alarm, came to her father's room, but the sight of him overcame her, and she was carried from his presence. By the help of proper applications, the Marquis recovered his senses, and his pains had a short cessation. "I am dying," said he, in a faltering accent. "Send instantly for the Marchioness and my son." Ferdinand, in escaping from the hands of the banditti, it was now seen, had fallen into the power of his father. He had been since confined in an apartment of the castle, and was now liberated to obey the summons. The countenance of the Marquis exhibited a ghastly image. Ferdinand, when he drew near the bed, suddenly shrunk back, overcome with horror. The Marquis now beckoned his attendants to quit the room, and they were preparing to obey, when a violent noise was heard from without. Almost in the same instant the door of the apartment was thrown open, and the servant, who had been sent for the Marchioness, rushed in. His look alone declared the horror of his mind. For words he had none to utter. He stared wildly, and pointed to the gallery he had quitted. Ferdinand, seized with new terror, rushed the way he pointed to the apartment of the Marchioness. A spectacle of horror presented itself. Maria lay on a couch lifeless and bathed in blood. A poignard, the instrument of her destruction, was on the floor, and it appeared from a letter which was found on the couch beside her that she had died by her own hand. The paper contained these words: "To the Marquis de Mazzini, your words have stabbed my heart. No power on earth could restore the peace you have destroyed. I will escape from my torture. When you read this, I shall be no more, but the triumph shall no longer be yours. The draught you have drunk was given by the hand of the injured. Maria de Mazzini." It now appeared that the Marquis was poisoned by the vengeance of the woman for whom he had resigned his conscience. The consternation and distress of Ferdinand cannot easily be conceived. He hastened back to his father's chamber, but determined to conceal the dreadful catastrophe of Maria del Vellorno. This precaution, however, was useless, for the servants, in the consternation of terror, had revealed it, and the Marquis had fainted. Returning pains recalled his senses, and the agonies he suffered were too shocking for the beholders. Medical endeavors were applied, but the poison was too powerful for antidote. The Marquis's pains at length subsided. The poison had exhausted most of its rage, and he became tolerably easy. He waved his hand for the attendants to leave the room, and beckoning to Ferdinand, whose senses were almost stunned by this accumulation of horror, bade him sit down beside him. "The hand of death is now upon me," said he. "I would employ these last moments in revealing a deed which is more dreadful to me than all the bodily agonies I suffer. It will be some relief to me to discover it." Ferdinand grasped the hand of the Marquis in speechless terror. "The retribution of heaven is upon me," resumed the Marquis. "My punishment is the immediate consequence of my guilt. Heaven has made that woman the instrument of its justice, whom I made the instrument of my crimes. That woman, for whose sake I forgot conscience and braved vice, for whom I imprisoned an innocent wife, and afterwards murdered her." At these words, every nerve of Ferdinand thrilled. He let go of the Marquis's hand and started back. "Look not so fiercely on me," said the Marquis in a hollow voice. "Your eyes strike death to my soul. My conscience needs not this additional pang." "My mother!" exclaimed Ferdinand. "My mother! Speak! Tell me!" "I have no breath," said the Marquis. "Oh, take these keys! The south tower! The trap-door! 'Tis possible! Oh!" The Marquis made a sudden spring upwards, and fell lifeless on the bed. The attendants were called in, but he was gone forever. His last words struck with the force of lightning upon the mind of Ferdinand. They seemed to say that his mother might yet exist. He took the keys, and ordering some of the servants to follow, hastened to the southern building. He proceeded to the tower, and the trap-door beneath the staircase was lifted. They all descended into a dark passage, which conducted them through several intricacies to the door of the cell. Ferdinand, in trembling, horrible expectation, applied the key. The door opened, and he entered. But what was his surprise when he found no person in the cell! He concluded that he had mistaken the place, and quitted it for further search. But having followed the windings of the passage by which he entered, without discovering any other door, he returned to a more exact examination of the cell. He now observed the door which led to the cavern, and he entered upon the avenue, but no person was found there, and no voice answered to his call. Having reached the door of the cavern, which was fastened, he returned lost in grief, and meditating upon the last words of the Marquis, he now thought that he had mistaken their import, and that the words "'tis possible" were not meant to apply to the life of the Marchioness. He concluded that the murder had been committed at a distant period, and he resolved, therefore, to have the ground of the cell dug up, and the remains of his mother sought for. When the first violence of the emotions excited by the late scenes was subsided, he inquired concerning Maria del Vellorno. It appeared that on the day preceding this horrid transaction, the Marquis had passed some hours in her apartment, that they were heard in loud dispute, that the passion of the Marquis grew high, that he upbraided her with her past conduct, and threatened her with a formal separation. When the Marquis quitted her, she was heard walking quick through the room in a passion of tears. She often suddenly stopped in vehement but incoherent exclamation, and at last threw herself on the floor, and was for some time entirely still. Here her woman found her, upon whose entrance she arose hastily, and reproved her for appearing uncalled. After this she remained silent and sullen. She descended to supper, where the Marquis met her alone at table. Little was said during the repast, at the conclusion of which the servants were dismissed, and it was believed that during the interval between supper and the hour of repose, Maria del Vellorno contrived to mingle poison with the wine of the Marquis. How she procured this poison was never discovered. She retired early to her chamber, and her woman, observing that she appeared much agitated, inquired if she was ill. To this she returned a short answer in the negative, and her woman was soon afterwards dismissed. But she had hardly shut the door of the room when she heard the lady's voice recalling her. She returned and received some trifling order, and observed that Maria looked uncommonly pale. There was besides a wildness in her eyes which frightened her, but she did not dare to ask any questions. She again quitted the room, and had only reached the extremity of the gallery when her mistress's bell rang. She hastened back. Maria inquired if the Marquis was gone to bed, and if all was quiet. Being answered in the affirmative, she replied, "This is a still hour, and a dark one. Good night." Her woman, having once more left the room, stopped at the door to listen, but all within remaining silent, she retired to rest. It is probable that Maria perpetrated the fatal act soon after the dismission of her woman, for when she was found 2 hours afterwards, she appeared to have been dead for some time. On examination, a wound was discovered on her left side, which had doubtless penetrated to the heart from the suddenness of her death and from the effusion of blood which had followed. These terrible events so deeply affected Amelia that she was confined to her bed by a dangerous illness. Ferdinand struggled against the shock with manly fortitude, but amid all the tumult of the present scenes, his uncertainty concerning Julia, whom he had left in the hands of banditti, and whom he had been withheld from seeking or rescuing, formed perhaps the most affecting part of his distress. The late Marquis de Mazzini and Maria del Vellorno were interred with the honours due to their rank in the church of the convent of St. Nicolo. Their lives exhibited a boundless indulgence of violent and luxurious passions, and their deaths marked the consequences of such indulgence, and held forth to mankind a singular instance of divine vengeance.